Welcome to my presentation from lockdown. This is all about the musical development of popular music undergraduates at the University of Liverpool. How do these musicians learn? Well, the big difference perhaps with the University of Liverpool is that whilst there's a huge focus on performing and gigging, 30% of the marks in each of the years are based on a reflective essay. And so the whole focus of this presentation is the role of reflective practice in musical learning. There's nothing new about reflective practice in higher education. Indeed, it's been around for over 20 years. But I think for musicians for whom learning is such a personal journey, the real challenge of reflection is that when you really get into it, it can be uncomfortable, just as Bood says. You recognise your own weaknesses. Perhaps you see what you're always avoiding, whether it's that mode practice if you're a jazz guitarist, whether it's really nailing the intonation as a vocalist. And that's perhaps where the real value lies, in getting into right inside the journey, into the nitty-gritty of how you learn. This approach of using reflective practice as an integral part of learning about performance started at the University of Liverpool in 2005. And it's really unlocked an enormous amount of resilience and independent learning in the undergraduates who have followed this approach. And it's also used with MUS students who do the course in musical performance and pedagogy. So what is it that we're really trying to achieve with the practice diary? And this isn't just relevant in higher education, this can be done in secondary education or in peripatetic music teaching. Yes, it starts with a narrative. What happened in the lesson? But the real key thing is to identify exactly what it is that isn't going right and to apply problem-solving skills, if you like, metacognitive practice strategies, as Susan Hallam describes them, in order to unpack that problem and find a way of solving it. And you need to set a task for the next time you practice, and you need to continually review the practice diary. And it's only after, let's say, 8 weeks of doing this every single time you practice that you begin to identify the patterns in individual learning, and you begin to get a real insight into how you learn, what you're avoiding, what you like to do, what you do for relaxation. And particularly in popular music, if you use this for band rehearsals, you begin to see what are the communication patterns in the band, who's leading a particular series of jamming out things, who is perhaps a little more passive, but maybe the thinking goes on after the rehearsal. Of course, doing something new is always difficult. And I think from Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, Alice nails it absolutely spot on. She generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it. And particularly reading first year undergraduate reflective essays, there are often comments about, well, I thought it was a good idea, but then I didn't really think it was for me. And the comment that you see here on the slide is from a second year guitarist who really only picked up the value of the practice diary in his second year. And I think having the patience to persevere with reflective practice is one of the things that is really quite hard to do. So any higher education institution has to think about assessment criteria, and it is notoriously difficult to mark reflective essays about musical learning because every musician will have a different musical biography, will play a different instrument, will be into different genres, and therefore to turn it into something that is very tightly controlled, like a tick box exercise, seems to completely defeat the whole object of the exercise, which is to enable that personal learning. So we came up with a so-called pathway of reflective practice. Now, these stages are in no way linear. So it does not mean that you move from phase 1 to phase 6. You can find in a first year undergraduate essay quite a lot of phase 1, so descriptions of what's been going on from a practice diary, and then suddenly there'll be an aha moment, a real breakthrough when the student understands that something has changed or that they are now working differently in their private practice. And in a way, you look at this as a portfolio of reflective skills, and the judgment from the tutors comes from being able to balance that with what you know of the student from their recitals, from their gigs, and how you can see them growing through the combination of the weekly performance workshops and then their own reflective practice. I want you to take you through a whistle-stop tour of some of the comments that the students wrote in their essays. This particular drummer, Lisa, who'd grown up in the Far East, she's Anglo-Vietnamese, was a typical popular musician, self-taught, not somebody who thought of herself as ever wanting to be taught how to drum. But by her third year, she recognised that in fact there was something she could get out of lessons. And in fact, she was taught by a student who had graduated a year above her. And that, for her, gave her a path into pedagogy which she felt comfortable with. And there's also possibly a gender issue here, because as a woman, and a very independent woman, she felt really quite uncomfortable about being taught in a very formal setting by a man. Individual practice, as always, is something which requires a lot of motivation. And particularly as a drummer, you need to go into the department to practice, but also if you want to use amps and other equipment, you're likely to be fighting for space in the department. So there were easy ways to get out of practicing. You could say it was the wrong time, there wasn't anywhere to go. But also it was simply, why did you need to practice? Because being in a band is about being in a band. Surely you don't need to do the practice. And I think the real insight comes in terms of the learning journey of popular musicians, is that as band material, and particularly writing your own material, becomes more important, you need to be able to play what you write. And it's not just a question of doing it in Pro Tools, it's you have to be able to perform it. And I think that becomes a much more important motivating factor for practice. And that's indeed reflected in practice diaries and reflective essays. So this, I think, is interesting. Whilst the classical musicians in the third year have a fairly disciplined approach to practice, the popular musicians are, if you like, unpacking a much more holistic picture of their own learning and what it means to be a popular musician. And by this stage, many of them were gigging not only on campus, but also off campus. Some were working as session musicians and were beginning to build up a portfolio of different job opportunities. And I think that meant that they were far more receptive to the idea of discovering new ways of working than perhaps the classical musicians, who in a sense in their third year had either then decided, okay, could I go to conservatoire and do a postgraduate diploma, or in fact, is music not going to be my life, and so I'm going to do something completely different. Now, gigging, of course, is the be-all and end-all for most popular musicians if they're not solo singer-songwriters. And in the first year at the University of Liverpool, students are put into bands by the tutor, which means that they don't self-select. It's not like going to BandSoc. And that did cause some amazing tensions and people who just didn't want to play with each other at all. On the other hand, it's remarkable that despite the fact that they had been put into bands, half of those bands stayed together for the subsequent 2 years. And actually, some of them were extremely successful. On the other hand, there were also bands that were put together for completely different reasons. One musician did a band and they entered Eurovision, and they then specifically picked the people he wanted to play with and treated it very much like a commercial record producer would do. Here are the musicians I want to work with. We've got 5 hours to nail this, into the studio, record, done, finished. So as you can see from this slide, writing your own material is a key part of band identity and also a sense of satisfaction and a motivation to practice. At the time that this research was conducted, there is in fact no songwriting module at all at the University of Liverpool. That has subsequently changed, which means that the emphasis on original material starts much earlier. At this particular period, from 2013 to 2015, We're talking about students who, if they were writing their own material, were really only doing it because that's what they love to do, and there was no outside support for that at all. Students are also encouraged to reflect on the gigs they go to, and as you can see, there are a range of different comments here from students in the cohort, both in terms of how they perceive groups from the audience perspective, but also what it was like to get involved. And there's one particular musician whose father was involved in the jazz scene in Northern Ireland, who had actually been gigging professionally since the age of 11, and he had a really deep insight into what it meant to be a performing musician. So if you like, if you want to put your finger on it, how do we define the effectiveness of this reflective practice? Well, one way of looking at it is to look at some of the constants. So of the students who got firsts, 92% of them were having one-to-one lessons. All of them were gigging outside of university. Okay, just under 40% of them were recording or making an EP or made some kind of television appearance, but 100% of them were writing their own material. And I think the importance here was the openness to get involved in every possible kind of musical opportunity, and also to relate that to the technical development. So if you like, the development of technical skills is very strongly focused on the desire to perform and the desire to perform in a professional context. So this is the pedagogical model which emerges from this research, and it posits the idea that musical learning is a kind of spiral which involves planning, doing, reflecting, and then changing. And that is where it's different from Kolb's learning spiral, and it embeds this learning in the socio-cultural context of where the learning takes place. So learning at UWL is not going to be the same as learning in the University of Liverpool, is not going to be the same as learning, let's say, at the Norwegian Academy of Music. And all of that goes together and allows each individual musician to develop their own trajectory. I've often been challenged at conferences and saying, well, so what? You know, we all do reflection in some way or another. And I think I want to strongly defend the idea that to make reflection effective, you need to have some kind of method of recording that reflection, such as a practice diary, and then a meta level where that practice diary is analysed and that analysis is assessed. Without an assessment weighting of 30% or more, I would suggest the real value of the reflective practice is lost. Of course, it needs to be adapted by institution, and certainly my colleagues in Australia take a slightly different approach. They tailor the reflective writing to each student and give them guidance and feedback, so that if you're already reflecting in a very mature way in your first year, you will be set tougher goals for the second and third year reflections. But I think it is important to bear in mind that if you overteach reflection, you completely lose the sense of that personal journey. And I really do think that you need to allow students to find their own way. The majority get it, and in a sense, for the popular musicians, whilst there might have been quite a lot of resistance to something that felt very unpop-like, it's not pop culture to have a practice diary, by the second and third year there is a dramatic transformation in the value that is put upon the reflective practice, and indeed keeping the practice diary. What about doing it as a blog or online? We've experimented a bit with this, and my experience is largely that things that are recorded in phones are recorded once and forever forgotten. Colleagues in Austria have tried doing a mediated weekly blog, but that appears to produce too much tutor influence, because there is then a cue consciousness that students are blogging in a forum which is moderated by their tutors, and they are trying to please their tutors. reflective practice isn't about pleasing your tutor. It's about learning about yourself. And that requires, if you like, freedom and the space to just find out what kind of a musician it is. It also seems important that if you really master the reflective practice, it is a lifelong learning. It's something which stays with you, whatever you do, whether you are a musician through and through, whether you have a portfolio career, whether you go into something completely different at some point in your life. And I think it also helps musicians, particularly multi-skilled musicians, to understand how they're transferring one set of musical knowledge and practice to another medium or to another instrument or to another genre. So, if you like, reflective practice is not easy, but on the other hand, it's enormously valuable and highly rewarding. And I could only recommend introducing it, using it, experimenting with it, and seeing where it goes. Now, this to me is important. I've been wanting for some time to do a follow-up study with the cohort that were part of my PhD research. And looking at their musical careers 5 years on, it's very, very interesting to see what has happened. So out of the original cohort, 13 students in popular music performance got firsts. And of those 13 students from popular music, half of them are still prominent in social media and elsewhere as practicing musicians. That's not to say that they make 100% of their income as practicing musicians. Amelia Lappert here on the right had tried for 4 years to make it a musician. She's now teaching primary music, but continues to promote her own music as a singer-songwriter on YouTube and other social media. Nico, the small picture, was a drummer and a drum tutor at the University of Liverpool. He's now reinvented himself as a singer-songwriter and is living in London. And Wandering Wings, down at the bottom, a group of classical and popular musicians from the University of Liverpool who created themselves as a function band with 2 different brands under the banner of Entertainment Nation. They have a small acoustic band, Wandering Wings, and they have a much larger party band, Jam Hot. But they've recently been offering on social media competitions for suggestions of covers that they should perform, and then winners who are selected at random for those who've liked Facebook pages and so forth are given their own personalised videos. So they are finding a way to, if not generate income, then at least generate interest and maintain their presence at a time when most of live gigging is utterly impossible. But what is so significant is that all of these students that I'm talking about are students who mastered reflective practice. And that, for me, is the proof of the pudding.